They say you can't fall in love with someone who bought you. That desire built in captivity isn't real, that freedom and submission can't coexist in the same heart. They're probably right, but that didn't stop me from trying.
The piano room. Storm raging outside, rain hammering against floor-to-ceiling windows like bullets. Sefina's hands on the keys, playing something haunting, a melody that sounds like grief set to music. Lightning flashes, illuminating her face for a split second, determined, terrified, alive. Chairman Lee Jun-seok materialized behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that his breath stirred the small hairs at the nape of her neck. He didn't touch her. He never touched her. That was the entire problem. "They say you can't fall in love with someone who bought you," Sefina said, her voice barely audible over the storm, her fingers never stopping their movement across the keys. "That desire built in captivity isn't real. That freedom and submission can't coexist in the same heart." His hand hovered over hers, millimeters from contact, close enough that she could feel the electromagnetic pull between their skin. Almost touching the keys, almost touching her. The anticipation was a physical ache in her chest. "They're probably right," she continued, her voice breaking slightly on the last word. "But that didn't stop me from trying." The music swelled, filled the room, matched the violence of the storm outside. Jun-seok's hand trembled in the air above hers, a man exercising control that was costing him everything. Then the scene shattered. 43 days earlier. The waiting room smelled like expensive perfume layered over fierce sweat. Sefina sat in a velvet chair that probably cost more than her entire education, wearing the only clean blouse she owned, white cotton with a coffee stain near the collar that she'd tried and failed to bleach out. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking no matter how many times she pressed them flat against her thighs. 5 other women occupied the room with her. They all had the same look, pretty enough to be valuable, desperate enough to be here. None of them made eye contact. Eye contact would make this real, would force them to acknowledge what they were about to become. The door opened. A woman in a red designer dress that hugged her curves like a second skin stepped inside. Her smile was practiced, professional, the kind of smile that could sell anything if you convinced yourself hard enough that you weren't really selling human beings. "Lot 17, she said, her voice smooth as silk over razor blades. "Sefina-sama." Sefina stood on legs that felt like water. The woman in red gestured toward the door with one perfectly manicured hand. French tips, blood-red polish. Of course. The hallway was shorter than Sefina expected. Shorter meant less time to change her mind, to turn around, to run. But running wasn't an option when Mr. Kwon's organization held 60 million won of debt over your head like a guillotine blade. Running wasn't an option when your student visa had 27 days left before expiration, and Seoul National University had permanently expelled you for plagiarism you didn't commit, because you'd refused to fuck your professor. The platform was small, barely a stage. Just enough room for one person to stand under lights bright enough to bleach out all individuality, to reduce a human being to a collection of attributes that could be assessed and valued. Sefina stepped up. The lights hit her face and she fought the instinct to raise her hand against them. Somewhere beyond the brightness, men sat in chairs. Wealthy men. Men who came to places like this because they could, because the world was built for men with enough money to buy whatever they wanted, including people. "Lot 17, the auctioneer's voice rang out, cultured and careful. "Sefina-sama, 23 years old, art background, Seoul National University, English fluent, Korean beginner level, 3-month placement contract, starting bid 20 million won. Sefina's eyes adjusted slowly to the lights. She could make out shapes now, shadows of men in the darkness beyond the platform. Most of them sat with the relaxed posture of people browsing a catalog, deciding between options, weighing value against cost. But one man sat differently. Back row, center, perfectly still in a way that suggested military discipline or obsessive control. His suit was dark, expensive, tailored to perfection. Silver touched his temples. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping a rhythm she couldn't hear but could somehow feel. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. Their eyes met across the distance, and the room seemed to contract, to collapse inward until there was nothing but that gaze. Dark eyes, calculating, empty of warmth but full of something else, interest, maybe, or hunger, or the particular attention of a predator that had just spotted prey worth the hunt. She should have looked away. Every instinct screamed at her to lower her eyes, to show submission, to make herself smaller and less threatening. But something in his stare, the absolute certainty of it, the way he looked at her like she was a problem he was already solving, made her angry, made her defiant, made her stare back with all the rage and fear and desperate pride she had left. His paddle rose, one sharp movement, deliberate, final. The auctioneer never even completed the second call. Sold, 45 million won, Chairman Lee Jun-seok. The private room where they explained the contract had walls the color of champagne and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. Sefina sat across from the woman in red, whose name was apparently Ms. Park, and tried to focus on the words being said rather than the way her entire future was being decided in legal jargon and precise financial calculations. Your debt to Mr. Kwon's organization is currently 60 million won, Ms. Park said, sliding a document across the table. Chairman Lee's purchase price of 45 million won will be distributed as follows. 35 million won directly to your debt, reducing it to 25 million won. The remaining 10 million won will be held in escrow as your completion bonus, to be released upon successful fulfillment of the 90-day contract. Sefina stared at the numbers. They blurred together, became abstract, just mathematics describing the sale of a human being. Additionally, Ms. Park continued, you will receive a monthly stipend of 5 million won for living expenses and personal needs. That's 15 million won over the course of the contract. Combined with the escrow bonus, you will have earned 25 million won total, exactly enough to clear your remaining debt. And if I leave early, Sefina's voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant, like it belonged to someone else. Early termination penalty is 50 million won, which you would be legally obligated to pay. Additionally, your original debt of 60 million won would be reinstated in full. Ms. Park's smile never wavered. But Chairman Lee's arrangements rarely end prematurely. He treats his companions very well. The word, companions, hung in the air like a euphemism, desperately trying to dress up something ugly in pretty clothes. Sefina signed. The pen felt heavy in her hand, like it weighed more than it should, like the ink was made of something denser than physics allowed. Her signature looked shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the bold signature she'd used to sign her university enrollment papers 3 years ago, back when she'd still believed the world rewarded hard work and talent and keeping your head down. Excellent, Ms. Park said, gathering the documents with efficient movements. Chairman Lee's driver will take you to the residence now. Mrs. Shin will be waiting to orient you to the household. The Mercedes was black, sleek, probably bulletproof. Sefina sat in the back seat watching Seoul's neon lights blur past the tinted windows, blues and pinks and electric whites advertising things she couldn't afford, lives she would never live, futures that belonged to other people. Chairman Lee sat across from her in the spacious rear compartment, staring out his own window. He hadn't looked at her once since they left the building. His fingers drummed against his knee in that same rhythm. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. The sound filled the silent car, became a countdown to something Sefina couldn't name. She studied him the way you study a storm system approaching, trying to predict its path, its intensity, whether you had time to find shelter. Everything about him screamed discipline. The perfect posture that never relaxed even in the privacy of his own vehicle. The suit that didn't dare wrinkle despite hours of wear. The watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her entire life up to this moment. But his hands never stopped moving. Restless. Controlled restlessness, but restless nonetheless. There was something underneath that perfect surface, something that needed constant management. Constant pressure to keep contained. When we arrive, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, still not looking at her, Mrs. Shin will orient you to the household rules and expectations. You'll have your own room, your own space. I don't need you in mine. The question escaped before Sefina could stop it, before she could think about whether asking was wise or safe or advisable. Then why buy me? He turned then, finally looked at her. His eyes were worse up close, not cruel exactly, but absolutely certain. The eyes of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he had the right to do whatever he wanted. Because I can, he said simply. The mansion was all glass and cold perfection, the kind of architecture that prioritized aesthetic over warmth, that made a statement about wealth and power, and the ability to live in a house that was more art installation than home. Every surface reflected something. Lights, furniture, Sefina herself looking small and out of place in her coffee-stained blouse and cheap shoes. Mrs. Shin was waiting in the foyer. She was maybe 55, maybe 60, one of those Korean women whose age was impossible to determine because they took care of themselves with the discipline of people who understood that appearance was armor. Her face was stern, weathered, the face of someone who had seen everything and judged most of it. Chairman Lee disappeared without a word, his footsteps echoing on marble floors until they faded into the depths of the house. Mrs. Shin watched him go with an expression Sefina couldn't quite read, concern, maybe, or resignation, or the particular exhaustion of people who had been fighting the same battle for too long. Come, Mrs. Shin said in English accented with Seoul's clipped precision. I'll show you to your room and explain the household rules. They walked through hallways lined with art that Sefina recognized from her studies, original pieces worth millions, displayed casually like they were poster prints from a student dormitory. Mrs. Shin moved with the confidence of someone who had walked these halls thousands of times, who knew every corner and shadow. The rules are simple, Mrs. Shin said, her voice neutral, professional. No closed doors. Privacy is granted, not taken. Dinner is at 7 p.m. sharp. You will eat with Chairman Lee. You do not enter the piano room under any circumstances. Ever. You do not leave the house after 7 p.m. without explicit permission. You address him as Chairman Lee unless he personally instructs you otherwise. Sefina wanted to ask why about all of it, especially the piano room, but something in Mrs. Shin's posture told her that questions would not be welcome. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The bedroom was beautiful in that same cold, perfect way as the rest of the house. Minimalist furniture. A bed that could sleep 4 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering sprawl, the city spreading out below like a galaxy of earthbound stars. For a moment, looking at that view, Sefina could almost forget she was in a cage. Your door stays open at night, Mrs. Shin said, gesturing to the doorway. Chairman's rule, no exceptions. Why? The question came out sharper than Sefina intended. Mrs. Shin's expression didn't change. Privacy is granted, not taken, she repeated, the words obviously something she'd said many times before. Those are the rules. You follow them or you leave. Simple. She turned to go, then paused in the doorway, her back still to Sefina. The others always left, she said quietly, so quietly Sefina almost missed it. You should too. Then she was gone, leaving Sefina alone in her beautiful, doorless cage with a view of a city she could see but not touch. Sefina didn't sleep that first night. She lay in the enormous bed listening to the sounds of the house, the hum of expensive air conditioning maintaining perfect temperature, the distant clink of glass from somewhere below, footsteps passing her open door at 2 a.m. His footsteps. She held her breath as they approached, slowed, stopped just outside her doorway. She kept her eyes closed, feigned sleep, but she could feel his presence there. Could feel the weight of his attention on her like a physical pressure against her skin. 30 seconds passed, maybe a full minute. Then the footsteps moved on, faded back into the depths of the house. Sefina released the breath she'd been holding and realized her hands were clenched into fists so tight her nails had left crescent marks in her palms. This was going to be a very long 90 days. The first 3 days passed in a strange, suspended animation. Sefina explored the boundaries of her confinement, walked through the public areas of the mansion, Found the studio Mrs. Shin had mentioned equipped with art supplies she hadn't bought, 8 meals that appeared on a tray outside her room prepared by a cook she never saw. Chairman Lee was a ghost in his own house. She heard him sometimes, his voice on phone calls conducted in rapid Korean she couldn't follow, his footsteps on the floors above, the sound of his car leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. But she never saw him. He was avoiding her, she realized, or maybe just ignoring her. Maybe to him she was just another piece of furniture, purchased and placed and requiring no further attention. On the 4th day, Mrs. Shin appeared at her door at 6:45 p.m., wearing the same stern expression she seemed to have permanently affixed to her face. "Dress for dinner," she said, eyeing Sefina's jeans and Seoul National University t-shirt with obvious disapproval. "Something appropriate. Chairman Lee will see you at 7. Sefina found a simple black dress in the closet, one of several that had appeared there sometime in the last 3 days, all in her exact size. The precision of it was unsettling. He'd known her measurements without asking, had purchased clothes for her body without seeing it. The level of preparation, of control, made her skin crawl, and something else she didn't want to name. The dress fit perfectly. Of course it did. The dining room had a table that could seat 20 people easily, but only 2 places were set, one at each end, an ocean of polished wood between them. Chairman Lee was already there, standing by the window in a dark suit, his posture perfect, his attention focused on his phone. He looked up when she entered, and that calculating gaze swept over her, assessing, cataloging, noting every detail. "Sit," he said simply. Sefina sat at the far end of the table. He put his phone away with a deliberate motion, gave her his full attention. The weight of it was staggering. "Posture," he said. She straightened instinctively, hated herself for the automatic obedience, but couldn't seem to stop her body from responding to the command in his voice. "Better," he nodded to Mrs. Shin, who appeared from a door Sefina hadn't noticed, and served the first course, something delicate and probably expensive, arranged on the plate like a small work of art. "You eat like you're afraid the food will run away." Sefina looked down at her hands, realized she'd been eating fast, shoveling food into her mouth with the efficiency of someone who'd been hungry before, who'd learned in shelters and cheap cafeterias that you ate what was in front of you quickly before someone decided you didn't deserve it. "I eat like someone who's been hungry before," she said, meeting his eyes across the impossible distance of the table. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, maybe, or recognition, or the particular interest of someone who just discovered their purchase was more complicated than anticipated. "Good," he said. "Then you understand scarcity. Scarcity teaches value." He demonstrated the proper pace, small bites, pauses between each one, posture maintained throughout. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, a performance of civilization and restraint. "Eating is not just consumption," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a lecture, a lesson being delivered. "It's communication. What you do with your hands, your mouth, your time, it all speaks. It tells the people around you who you are, what you value, how you see yourself in relation to them." "And what am I communicating right now?" Sefina asked, forcing herself to match his pace despite every instinct screaming at her to eat faster, to finish, to get out of this room and away from the intensity of his attention. "That you're educable," he said, taking a sip of wine from a glass that probably cost more than her monthly stipend. "That you can learn control, that you're more intelligent than you pretend to be." They ate in silence for several minutes. Sefina focused on her breathing, on keeping her hands steady, on projecting a calm she absolutely did not feel. The food was excellent. She barely tasted it. "Have you seen Peppermint Candy?" he asked suddenly. She looked up, confused by the non sequitur. "What?" "The film, Lee Chang-dong, 1999. About a man moving backward through his life, trying to understand where he lost himself, where the version of him that could love and feel and be human got buried under trauma and compromise and the weight of just surviving." Sefina shook her head. "Before my time." He smiled barely, just a ghost of expression that was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I forget. You were born the year that film came out. You make me feel ancient. How old are you? 46. He studied her across the table, his gaze intense enough that she felt it like a touch. You're 23. 23 years ago, I was already running my father's company. You were being born. Does that bother you? Should it? Most people would say yes. The power imbalance, the age gap, the circumstances. He gestured vaguely at the mansion around them, at the situation they both knew they were in, at the transaction that had brought her here. But I find that people rarely know what actually bothers them until someone shows them, until someone holds up a mirror and forces them to look at what they've been avoiding. The dinner lasted 2 hours. He taught her about wine, how to hold the glass by the stem, how to taste properly, rolling the liquid across her palate to identify notes and undertones. About conversation, the power of strategic silence, when to speak, and when to let silence do the work for you. About sitting, how to own a chair versus perching on it like a bird ready for flight. It felt almost paternal in its careful instruction, almost kind in its attention to her education, until Sefina realized that everything he was teaching her was about control. His control of space, time, behavior. Her body learning to obey before her mind had consciously decided to comply. She tested him after that dinner. Small rebellions to see where the boundaries actually were, whether the rules had any teeth or were just suggestions dressed up as commands. The next morning she wore her own clothes, the jeans and faded Seoul National University t-shirt that were the last remnants of her old life. He said nothing at breakfast, just glanced at her once with those dark, assessing eyes and returned to his newspaper. But when she went back to her room that afternoon, her clothes were gone. All of them. Only the dresses remained, hanging in the closet like a uniform she hadn't agreed to wear. She stayed up past midnight sketching, portraits of people she'd known at university, places she missed, her mother's face from memory since she hadn't seen her in 2 years. Chairman Lee appeared in her doorway at 1 a.m., backlit from the hallway so she couldn't see his expression, just his silhouette. He didn't say anything, just stood there for exactly 5 seconds watching her draw, watching her defiance, watching her exercise the small freedom of staying awake when maybe he wanted her asleep. Then he left without a word. She asked Mrs. Shin about the piano room the next day, while the older woman was supervising the cook's preparation of lunch. Mrs. Shin's face went pale, all the blood draining out of it like someone had opened a valve. "You don't ask about that room," she whispered, glancing around like the walls had ears, like the house itself was listening and reporting back. "You follow the rules, girl, especially that one." "Why? What happened there?" But Mrs. Shin just shook her head and walked away faster than Sefina had ever seen her move, like she was fleeing something, like the question itself was dangerous. He never punished her directly. That was the trick, the particular cruelty of it. He just adjusted, responded, reshaped her environment with such precision that rebellion became just another behavior for him to observe and manage. Her clothes disappeared, but he didn't scold her. He just removed the option. She stayed up late, but he didn't order her to bed. He just appeared, a silent reminder that privacy was an illusion here, that even her small acts of defiance were witnessed and catalogued. He controlled her environment so completely that fighting back felt pointless, like punching water. There was nothing solid to resist against, just this constant, gentle pressure reshaping her world millimeter by millimeter. And God help her, somewhere in the first week, Sefina started to want to be solved, started to crave that careful, deliberate attention, started to feel like maybe if she was good enough, obedient enough, interesting enough, he would see her as something more than a purchase, would see her as a person worth the effort of all this meticulous control. The realization made her hate herself, but that didn't make it less true. One weekend, Sefina found him in his study at midnight. The door was open. His doors were always open, just like he demanded hers be. He was reading, glasses perched on his nose, making him look almost human, almost approachable. Almost. "Can I ask you something?" she said from the doorway. He didn't look up. "You just did." "Why me? At the auction, why did you choose me?" He marked his page with one finger and removed his glasses, folding them carefully and setting them on the desk. When he finally looked at her, it felt like being X-rayed, like he could see through skin and bone to whatever was underneath. "Because you were the only one who didn't look away when I stared at you," he said. "Everyone else lowered their eyes, trained dogs, already broken before I even bought them. But you looked back. You looked angry. So you bought me for my pride. I bought you to see if I could break it." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "I'm still deciding if I want to." Sefina's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in her temples. "And what if I don't break? Then I've made an excellent investment." He picked up his book again, a clear dismissal. "Or a terrible mistake. Time will tell. 43 days left until we find out." That night, lying in her doorless room, Sefina realized she was afraid of the wrong thing. She wasn't afraid he'd touch her, force himself on her, exercise the physical power he obviously had. She was afraid he wouldn't. Afraid that after 90 days of this careful, controlled attention, he'd simply let her go. Afraid she'd have spent 3 months learning to crave something she'd never actually receive, training herself like Pavlov's dog to salivate for a bell that would never ring. The thought terrified her more than any physical threat could have. The typhoon hit Seoul in week 3. The weather reports had been warning about it for days, showing satellite images of the massive storm system bearing down on the Korean peninsula like a fist. But Sefina hadn't expected the sheer violence of it when it finally arrived. Wind that sounded like screaming. Rain against the glass walls so hard she thought they'd shatter, thought the whole beautiful, perfect house would come apart under the assault. Then the power died. The silence was overwhelming. Just rain and wind and her own heartbeat thundering in her ears loud enough to drown out thought. Sefina left her room with some vague idea of finding candles or flashlights, but really she was looking for him. The mansion was a maze of shadows and reflections in the darkness, her own ghost following her through hallways lit only by lightning flashes. She found the piano room door ajar. She'd never been close to it before, had given it a wide berth like Mrs. Shin had warned, like it was radioactive or haunted or both. But with the power out and the house groaning under the storm's weight, rules felt less solid, felt like suggestions that could be ignored. Sefina pushed the door open. The room was smaller than she'd imagined. Just a grand piano, beautiful even in the lightning flash visibility, probably worth more than most cars and walls lined with photographs. She could make out shapes in the intermittent light, a woman's face, smiling. The same woman at different ages, different settings, always smiling. Always with him, younger then, not yet carved into the severe figure he was now. His wife had to be. Sefina sat at the piano bench. Her fingers found the keys in the dark, muscle memory from childhood lessons before everything went wrong, before her father died and they lost the house, and then the piano, and then any pretense that their family was going to be okay. Her hands remembered something slow and melancholic, something that matched the storm outside, something that felt like grief. She felt him before she heard him. A presence behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, close enough that the small hairs on the back of her neck stood up in response to his proximity. "I gave you one rule." His voice was low, dangerous, vibrating with something that might have been rage or might have been pain. One absolute rule. Sefina didn't stop playing. "You gave me many rules. I'm just deciding which ones matter." His hand shot out and caught her wrist, firm enough to stop her playing, not violent but absolutely immovable, like being grabbed by a machine. "This one matters." She turned on the bench to face him. In the lightning flashes, his face was a study in barely controlled something, rage or grief or both, emotions too big for his usual perfect restraint to contain. "Then tell me why." For a long moment he said nothing. Just held her wrist, his thumb against her pulse point where he could feel her heart racing, could feel the physical proof of his effect on her. Then he released her and stepped back, put distance between them like it cost him something to do it. "My wife played this piano," he said, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested how much effort that control required. "She played that exact song the night she killed herself. The tabloids said I controlled her, that I broke her with my rules, my expectations, my need to orchestrate every aspect of her life. They were right." The room felt airless. Sefina couldn't breathe properly, like the storm had sucked all the oxygen out of the space between them. Then why buy another woman you can control? He laughed, a harsh, broken sound that had nothing to do with humor. To prove I can let you go, to prove that control isn't the same as possession, that I can have something beautiful in my house and not destroy it. He moved to the photographs on the wall, touched one gently, a gesture that was almost tender. She was 26 when we married, I was 38. Everyone said I was too old, too rigid, that I'd smother her. I promised I wouldn't, but I did it anyway, slowly, carefully. With love, I told myself. Until the day she took every pill in the medicine cabinet and sat at this piano and played this song one last time. I'm sorry, Sefina said, because what else was there to say? Don't be. He turned back to her, and in the lightning flash she saw his face clearly, raw, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm conducting an experiment. Can I have you here, teach you, shape you, watch you become extraordinary, and then let you walk away? Can I prove that control doesn't have to mean destruction? What if I don't want to walk away? His jaw tightened, muscle jumping under skin. That's not your choice to make yet. It won't be real until the contract ends, until you're truly free to go and choose to stay instead. They stood there in the dark, the storm raging outside, the ghost of his wife hanging between them like smoke. Get out of this room, he said finally, and his voice cracked on the last word. Please. Sefina left, but something had broken open that night, and they both knew it. Both felt the shift like tectonic plates moving deep underground, like the beginning of an earthquake that would reshape everything. The morning after the storm, Sefina stood in her room staring at her packed bag on the bed. The door was unlocked. It always had been. She could leave. The typhoon qualified as force majeure, no penalty. Mrs. Shin appeared in the doorway. The others always left after he told them, she said quietly. You're the first who stayed the night after finding out. Sefina's hand hovered over the bag's zipper. The choice was hers. It had always been hers. She just had to decide if she was brave enough to make it. End part 1. Drop a comment and tell me, should Sefina leave or stay? Your answer might influence what happens in part 2. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of this story. Because what happens next changes everything.